A Life After April. Chapter 7. My Mother Never Said I Couldn't Love Them. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. My mother never told me I couldn't love them. She never had to. Silence is a kind of teaching and omission, a lesson all its own. You don't always know you're learning it. You don't always recognize the rules as they settle into your bones. Not at first. She never said that love had a color, but I knew. Just as I knew which fork to use at dinner. Just as I knew that good girls kept their voices soft and their dresses clean. Just as I knew that good girls cross their ankles and say thank you even when they don't mean it. Just as I knew which neighborhoods we did not walk through and which men my father did not shake hands with. I knew because of the way she pressed her fingers into my wrist when I wandered too far from her in town. The way she would lower her voice when speaking to a Negro man, that careful politeness, light as lace but heavy as lead. I knew because of the way she never met the maid's eyes too long, never asked about her family, never wondered where she went when she stepped out our back door at the end of the night. I knew because of the way the world around me worked, the way Mr. Delaney, the grocer, would take my father's order before a coloured man who had been standing there first, the way the woman at Woolworth's wiped down the counter after they left, the way a white man could shout, spit, even strike, and the other faces in the room would turn away, adjusting their cuffs, pretending not to hear. And I knew because of the warnings, the ones passed between women like well-kept secrets. Because my mother's smile was warm when the Negro postman tipped his cap, but it thinned when she saw me smile back. Because when I was 16 and I said I liked the way Billy Jackson laughed, her hand tightened around the iron skillet, and she told me, without ever looking at me, that there were things I could not afford to be foolish about. There were rules written in books, but there were other rules too, the kind that weren't written at all. Rules you felt in the stiffness of a room, in the quickening of your mother's breath, in the way a name could fall heavy and dangerous between two white men at the hardware store. At 16, I only half understood. At 20, I chose not to see. And now, at 76, I know the truth of it. Love wasn't the thing I had to fear. It was the silence that let the wrongs pile up, that let boys disappear in the night, that let a man lower his head and step aside without ever demanding his rightful place. It was the silence that did the real harm. No, my mother never told me I couldn't love them. But she didn't have to. The world had already done the telling for her. And I, like so many others, listened. I had a friend once. I never called her that, not out loud, but we played together in the back lot behind the store while our mothers shopped. It was a narrow, sunlit space between brick walls, the kind of place where a child's imagination could take root, where pebbles became treasure, and a broken crate was a castle. We were just two little girls, dust kicking up around our shoes, hands smudged from drawing shapes in the dirt. We laughed, not knowing yet what it meant to be cautious with each other. Then one day, she looked at me and said she couldn't play anymore. Just like that. There was no anger in her voice, no sadness. Just a quiet resignation that I did not understand at the time. I asked her why, but she didn't answer, only looked over her shoulder. I followed her gaze and saw a woman standing there, arms folded, her mouth pressed into a firm line. I don't know if it was her mother or aunt or neighbor, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. Something had been decided, and she was simply the messenger. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we could still play, that it didn't have to matter. But even as I opened my mouth, I felt the weight of another gaze, my mother's, watching from the store window. That was the moment I understood. Not in words, not in lessons spelled out for me, but in the way my friend's eyes darted away in the stiffness of my mother's spine. I understood in the way a child does, through feeling more than thought, through the hush that falls over a room when something unspoken is understood by all. When I got home that evening, my mother smoothed my hair and told me she was glad I was a good girl who knew better than to mix in where I didn't belong. She didn't say it cruelly, She said it as if it was simply the natural order of things, like telling me not to touch the stove or not to play in the road, a rule for my own good. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what else to do. I was just a child, and silence, I've learned, is as much an answer as anything else. For years after, I thought of her. I imagined running into her again, years older, when we were past the age of rules and watchful eyes. I imagined telling her that I didn't understand then, but I did now. That I should have fought harder even though I wouldn't have known how. But of course, that's the kind of thing you only think of long after the moment has passed, when it is too late to reach across the divide that was placed between you. Now, at 76, I wonder where she is. I wonder if she remembers me at all, or if I was just another white girl she once played with for a few afternoons before learning, as I did, that there are lines in this world that cannot be crossed without consequence. I wonder if she carried that lesson differently than I did, if she had already known it before I ever learned. I look back now and know the truth. She was not the one who left. She was not the one who made the choice. I was. Or maybe it was made for me, and I accepted it. And that perhaps is the deepest regret of all. My mother's hands were always moving, folding linens, polishing silver, adjusting the brim of her hat in the reflection of a department store window. They were delicate hands, careful hands, hands that could smooth and soothe or press and push, gently, without force, without spectacle. Hands that performed their duty with quiet precision, with the certainty of someone who had learned their role and perfected it. She knew how to keep things in their place. She knew how to soften a slight, how to smooth out an insult so that it landed quietly, so that it felt like an understanding rather than an offense. She knew how to look at a black woman who had raised another woman's children and thank her, in a voice that was both sweet and final, a voice that said, "That is all you will ever be to us." She was not cruel, not in the way that left bruises or raised voices. No, her cruelty was refined, polished like the silver she kept locked in the china cabinet, brought out only when company came. It was a cruelty of omission, of knowing exactly when to extend a kindness and when to withhold it. She smiled at the girl who bagged her groceries but never asked her name. She pressed $1 into the hand of the woman who cleaned our house, but never looked her in the eye. She spoke politely to the man fixing the porch but never asked about his family, about where he went when he left us, about the lives that existed outside the periphery of her own comfort. She taught me how to fold napkins into crisp triangles, how to place a salad fork just so, how to keep my voice measured and light. But more than that, she taught me the art of distance, the way to be warm without ever inviting heat, the way to be gracious without ever offering grace. She taught me how to keep myself apart. I learned from my mother that silence was not merely an absence of words, but a choice, an action as deliberate as speech. I learned that white women like her, like me, did not have to be loud to hold power. We could smile while drawing the lines. We could whisper while keeping the doors closed. I used to think she was simply a product of her time, a woman shaped by the world she was born into, moving within the boundaries she had been given. But that is too easy, isn't it? To let her off with history as an alibi. No, my mother knew exactly what she was doing, and so did I. And now, at 76, I wonder, what did I truly learn from my mother's hands? Not just how to smooth linens or fold myself into politeness, but how to fold myself into silence, into complicity, into a world built on boundaries so well maintained they could almost be mistaken for kindness. The men in my life never needed to raise their voices. Their power was quieter than that, heavier. It settled into rooms like smoke, filling every corner until there was no air left for anything else. My father, my brothers, my husband, they all carried the weight of something I did not yet have words for. And yet I understood it. I understood it the way I understood a slammed door meant to stay shut, the way I understood that certain conversations ended when men entered the room. I remember my father coming home one evening, shaking his head, laughing under his breath about a boy who forgot his place at the service station. I didn't know what he meant, not exactly, but I knew it was no joke. I knew because my mother didn't laugh. I knew because the next morning I saw the boy's father standing outside that same station, hat in hand, waiting to be told if his son still had a job. And I knew then that men like my father could take things from men like him, and that women like my mother would never dare to say otherwise. The white men I grew up around did not have to be cruel outright. That would have been too obvious, too inelegant. Instead, they let their laughter do the cutting, their silence do the work. They leaned back in their chairs while another man was put in his place. They let the world run exactly as it always had, because to question it, to challenge it, would have meant letting go of something they never acknowledged they were holding on to. And what did we do? We nodded, we smiled, we looked away. We told ourselves we were not the ones holding the knife. We were not the ones passing the judgment, delivering the blow. But we were there, in the rooms where it happened, in the cars where the laughter lingered, in the homes where the silence took root. We sat beside them, across from them, under the same roofs, at the same tables. We poured their coffee, ironed their shirts, kissed them goodnight. We loved them. And that love required silence. The first time I realized what that silence cost, I was 16. I was standing in the grocery store with my mother when a black boy about my age reached for something at the same time as a white man. There was a pause, only a moment, but I felt it in my bones. The air sharpened, the world narrowed, and then came the correction. A small shove, a muttered warning, a lesson taught in the space between one breath and the next. The boy did not argue. He lowered his eyes and moved away. My mother exhaled, barely audible, and we went on with our shopping. I have spent my life thinking about that moment, about all the moments like it, all the men who delivered them, all the women who swallowed them whole. I have thought about the men who looked away and the women who watched them do it. And now, at 76, I wonder which was worse. Time does a strange thing when you look back. It softens what was once sharp, blurs the edges, makes even the worst things feel like something that happened to someone else. The world I grew up in is a place I recognize only in fragments now. Voices carried on the wind, a smell from the past rising up suddenly in a room, a certain way the afternoon light slants against a window pane. And yet, in the quietest moments, the past comes into focus again, sharp as glass. At 76, I see what I refused to see at 20. The conversations we never had. The questions I never asked. The things I let happen around me without protest, without pause, without a second thought. It is the weight of those things, the absence of them, really, that I feel now, heavier than all the words I ever did say. I think about how history has moved forward, how people speak openly now of things that once lived only in the spaces between sentences, buried under layers of politeness and fear. I hear words that were never spoken in my youth, words like privilege, complicity, systemic, and I wonder what it might have changed if I had heard them sooner, if I had dared to say them myself. The world moved forward without waiting for me to catch up. It changed while I remained still, while I accepted what I had been taught, while I carried on with the quiet certainty that the way things were was the way they were meant to be. And then one day, I was old. And all around me were younger people who had found their voices, who were willing to say the things I never did, who had learned far earlier than I ever did that silence is its own form of violence. But what does it mean to know something when it is too late to change it? What does it mean to see clearly when the road behind you is longer than the one ahead? There are things I can never undo, people I can never apologize to, moments I can never reclaim. I wonder what kind of person I might have been if I had learned sooner. If I had seen the lines before I crossed them, Or better yet, if I had refused to let them be drawn at all. But the past does not give itself over to revision. It simply lingers, waiting for you to decide what to do with it. This is the cost of looking back, to finally see, and to know that seeing is not enough,